In the early 1970s, the Bee Gees were finished. Not struggling, finished. The hitmakers of the 1960s had become a punchline, a nostalgia act reduced to playing tiny cabaret clubs for audiences who barely remembered them. The record label had lost interest. The hits had stopped. By every measure, their moment had come and gone. 5 years later, those same three brothers made the best-selling album in the history of recorded music and dominated the charts like no act since the Beatles. How? The answer is one of the strangest twists in music history. Because the secret weapon that resurrected the Bee Gees wasn't a marketing plan or a lucky break. It was a voice, a soaring falsetto that Barry Gibb didn't even know he had, discovered completely by accident when a producer asked him to do one simple thing. Scream. This is the story of how a washed-up band clawed its way back to the very top of the world and then got punished for it. Chapter 1. From the top of the world to the bottom. To feel how far the Bee Gees fell, you have to know how high they'd been. Barry, Robin, and Morris Gibb, three brothers with an almost supernatural gift for harmony, had conquered the 1960s. Aching ballads like To Love Somebody, Massachusetts, and I Started a Joke made them one of the biggest groups on the planet. Their manager, Robert Stigwood, had once talked about them as the next Beatles, and then it all drained away. As the 1960s became the 1970s, the hits dried up. The brothers fought and briefly split. Their albums stopped selling. By the mid-70s, the group that had been called the next Beatles was playing small rooms on the cabaret circuit, the place careers go to quietly die. Their 1974 album barely registered on the charts at all. They weren't a rising band with a bright future. They were a fading act the industry had already written off. And the smartest people in the business assumed the Bee Gees story was basically over. It was about to start all over again, because of a piece of advice from an unlikely friend. Chapter 2. The voice he didn't know he had. The friend was Eric Clapton. He just recorded a comeback album of his own at a studio called Criteria in Miami, and he told the Bee Gees something simple: go to America. Get Americanized. Soak up the sound of American rhythm and blues. So in early 1975, the brothers packed up and moved to Miami and teamed with a producer named Arif Mardin, a master of R&B and soul. Mardin pushed them to stop being a polite British ballad group and start chasing funk, groove, and dance rhythms. Almost immediately it worked. A track called Jive Talkin' became their first #1 hit in 4 years. But the real miracle happened during a song called Nights on Broadway. Mardin wanted more excitement in the chorus, so he turned to Barry Gibb and asked him a strange question. Could he scream? Could he scream in tune? Barry wasn't sure, but he tried, pushing his voice higher and higher until, without warning, he hit a piercing, powerful falsetto he had never known was in him. Everyone in the room froze. That was the sound. That accidental falsetto became the single most recognizable voice in disco. And the album it appeared on, Main Course, did exactly what everyone said was impossible. It dragged the Bee Gees back from the dead and made them stars again. They'd been saved. What they didn't know was that a phone call from France was about to make them the biggest band on earth. Chapter 3. The album written in a weekend, sight unseen. By 1977, the Bee Gees were in France, recording in a crumbling old chateau outside Paris, mostly for tax reasons, when their manager Robert Stigwood called from Los Angeles. He was putting together a small, low-budget film about the New York disco scene. It didn't even have a proper title yet. Did they have any songs lying around? They almost said no. They were busy. They hadn't read a script. They didn't know what the movie was about. Someone later described the whole briefing as, "It's about a guy who works in a paint store and blows his paycheck at a club on Saturday night." That was it. That was all they had to go on. And with almost nothing to work with, the brothers sat on the staircase of that chateau and in what Robin Gibb called virtually a single weekend, wrote Stayin' Alive, Night Fever, How Deep Is Your Love, More Than a Woman, and If I Can't Have You. An entire era of music, written in a couple of days for a film they'd never seen. Then came the accident that made history. Their drummer, Dennis Bryan, had to leave suddenly when his mother died, and there was no replacement to be found. A drum machine sounded terrible, so the producers took just 2 bars of Bryan's drumming from the already finished Night Fever, spliced the tape into a physical loop that ran around a microphone stand, and played the whole of Stayin' Alive on top of it. It was meant to be temporary, but it felt so alive, so human, that they kept it, one of the first drum loops in pop history. They even credited a made-up drummer named Bernard Lupe as a joke. Other producers started trying to hire him, before realizing he didn't exist. A band nobody wanted, writing for a movie they'd never seen, playing over a looped scrap of tape. And it became the biggest record the world had ever heard. Chapter 4, bigger than anyone since the Beatles. When Saturday Night Fever was released, it didn't just succeed. It swallowed the culture whole. The soundtrack sat at number 1 for 24 straight weeks. 4 of its songs went to number 1. It sold around 25 million copies within a few years and more than 40 million over time, making it the best-selling album in history up to that point, a record it held until Michael Jackson's Thriller. It won the Grammy for Album of the Year, and the numbers around Barry Gibb personally are almost unbelievable. He became the first songwriter ever to have 4 songs in the American top 10 at the same time. Between Christmas of 1977 and the middle of 1978, songs written by the Gibb brothers, including hits for their little brother Andy, held the number 1 spot in America for something like 25 out of 32 weeks. No one had ruled the charts like that since the Beatles. The washed-up cabaret act from a few years earlier now owned the entire music industry. It should have been the happiest ending imaginable. Instead, being that big and being the face of disco was about to become the worst thing that ever happened to them. Chapter 5, Punished for Winning. Because when the backlash against disco came, it needed a face to hate. And the most famous disco act in the world was 3 brothers in white suits singing in falsetto. When the anti-disco movement exploded, the record burnings, the Disco Sucks crusade, the riot at a Chicago ballpark in 1979, the Bee Gees took the full force of it. Almost overnight, radio stations that had played them constantly refused to touch them. In America, one of the biggest bands of the decade became nearly invisible for years. They were mocked, dismissed, treated as a joke, the very definition of a fad that had curdled. And the cruelest part is that they never even considered themselves a disco band. As Robin Gibb put it years later, they weren't disco, the people copying them were disco. They were a harmony group who happened to make a few dance records and got buried under the collapse of an entire genre. They grew so bitter about their signature hit that they once joked they'd like to dress Stayin' Alive in a white suit and set it on fire. The band that had climbed all the way back from the dead had been knocked down again. So they did the only thing they knew how to do. They disappeared and quietly took over the charts a second time where nobody could see them. Chapter 6, The Secret Kings of the 1980s. Here's the twist almost nobody realizes. Through the 1980s, when the name Bee Gees was considered poison in America, the Gibb brothers were secretly behind some of the biggest hits of the decade, just under other people's names. That was Barry Gibb writing and producing Woman in Love, the biggest hit of Barbra Streisand's career. That was the Bee Gees behind Dionne Warwick's comeback, Heartbreaker. That was their song, Islands in the Stream, becoming an eternal anthem for Kenny Rogers and Dolly Parton. That was Barry giving Diana Ross a number 1 hit with Chain Reaction. The men radio had banished were quietly writing the soundtrack of the very era that had rejected them, and the recognition eventually came all the way back around. The Bee Gees became the first group to score a UK number 1 single in 3 different decades. In 1997, they were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. All told, they sold somewhere north of 200 million records, placing them among the best-selling musical artists of all time. The men everyone had written off, twice, turned out to be one of the most successful songwriting forces in the history of popular music. There's a bittersweet ending to all of this. The magic of the Bee Gees was always that harmony, three brothers whose voices fit together like nothing else. Andy Gibb died young in 1988. Morris passed in 2003, and Robin in 2012, leaving Barry as the last brother standing, carrying all of it alone. But the songs never died, and they never will. A band that got dismissed as a disco fad wrote music that has now outlived the backlash, outlived the mockery, and outlived most of the men who made it. They were counted out in the 60s, resurrected in Miami, crowned in a French chateau, buried by the backlash, and vindicated all over again from the shadows. Very few artists survive one fall. The Bee Gees survived two and came back bigger every time. Now we'd love to hear from you. What's your favorite Bee Gees song, the one that instantly takes you back? And be honest. Did you ever join in on the Disco Sucks pylon back in the day, or were you defending them the whole time? Tell us in the comments. We read every single one, and the best stories become the next video.